Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by Frederick Taylor, who has written The Berlin Wall, which we are going to talk about today. And as you can see, I'm holding it up right beside me here if you're watching on YouTube. And let's begin. How did this book come about, and what is it about the Berlin Wall that still captures people's popular imagination? And of course, Checkpoint Charlie is obviously one of the most famous legacies, if I may say, from the Berlin Wall. But let's talk a little bit about how the Berlin Wall captured people's popular imagination today. And we're going to talk about this, of course, in this episode. So let's begin now.
Well, the building of the Berlin Wall in itself was something extremely dramatic and bizarre. To have a large city of 4 million people suddenly divided down the middle, even its sewage connections and its electricity and its phone lines being essentially cut down the middle, and a wall, a fence, depending where you were in the city. But anyway, a hard to cross barrier, lethally defended by guards, put down the middle of a major city and right round it. So, I mean, West Berlin was surrounded. About 26 miles of it was actually the border with East Berlin. The rest of it, another 96 miles, was bordering on East German territory itself. So you had this city of like 2 and a bit million people completely surrounded by guard towers and a fence and so on. I mean, I went to East Berlin because I'm old enough in 1965 when it was still the Wild East there. And the wall itself was a relatively recent phenomenon. And that really gripped me. I mean, I remember it being built too, watching it on TV. But that really gripped me going there in 65. And it also, of course, gave me an interest in German history, which influenced my career very strong. So that visit to Berlin, including East Berlin at one point, at the age of 17, really got me gripped. And I just wanted to know more about it and to understand what I was looking at and what was happening and where that fitted or did not fit into where Europe was going in my lifetime. Because obviously, as a 17-year-old, I could see we'd gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis, we'd gone through all sorts of other, crises between East and West in the previous few years. It seemed grim. The situation in Berlin seemed grim. You could occasionally still hear noises from the wall area in 65 that sounded to me like gunfire. I don't know whether they were, but they might well have been because there was still quite a lot of people trying to cross and still quite a lot of deaths occurring at that point. So it gripped me and it seemed so symbolic of the differences between East and West. Not all negative, by the way. I found aspects of East Berlin quite interesting. The free kindergartens, the more relaxed social mores, all the rest of it, compared with West Berlin, which in many ways seemed like quite an uptight place. Um, so, but on the whole, if you're building a wall to keep people in and out of the West, then you have a problem.
So the opposite of what
Otherwise, there
Donald
would
Trump
be no wall.
wants.
I beg your pardon.
So the opposite of what Donald Trump wants.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, of course, the East Germans claimed that they were trying to keep all these fascists out of East Germany. That's why they helped to build the wall. But really, of course, the aim was to stop the hemorrhaging of, uh, by then, millions of East German citizens into West Germany, looking for more prosperous and freer life than they could live in East Germany. About 2.5 million had somehow found their way from East Germany into West Germany between the end of the 1940s and 1961 when the wall was built. And that was a problem that had to be solved. You could solve it by bettering their standard of living, making East Germany a freer place, perhaps, or at least lessen the hemorrhaging. But of course, they didn't want to do that because, I mean, the Ulbricht, the East German leader, was basically an old-fashioned Stalinist. He was not interested in that kind of mollycoddling of his population. So the only if you couldn't stop them from leaving or dissuade them from leaving or somehow make life better in East Germany, then the only choice you had was to shut people in, make sure they couldn't get out. Because a lot of the people who had gone to the West were skilled people, they were doctors, they were scientists, they were teachers, they were academics, they were experts of all kinds in industry, and a lot of industrial companies that had been based in the East before the war and before communism came to East Germany had also moved their HQs to West Germany. Carl Zeiss Jena was one of them. The Wella cosmetics company, which is a huge company before the war, based in Eastern Germany, had all moved their HQ to West Germany. Obviously, the East German government was rapidly nationalizing and basically confiscating these companies from their free war owners. So that was the answer they had. It was very drastic. The Russians were not very keen on the idea initially. Ulbricht, the East German leader, had to persuade them basically that this was the only way they were going to keep hold of the East German satellite, which was a very precious thing to the Russians. Their bit of Germany was their reward for having won the Second World War, and they didn't want to let go of it.
And I understand that we spoke a little bit about this before the recording, that you want to understand a little bit about Berlin itself as well, and the geopolitics and the city itself before we start to go into the Soviet invasion of Berlin in 1945. So let's begin with a little bit of talking about Berlin's density and the city itself as well, which I know you want to talk a little bit about.
Berlin is quite far east. It's of pre-First World War Germany, Berlin is roughly in the middle. Of post-First World War Berlin, of Germany, where obviously they lost a lot of the eastern territories to Poland. It was not quite the middle, but it still remained a huge center for industry, the arts, creative life, a very lively place. Lots of immigrants, Jews, Poles, lots of people from Eastern Europe in particular, found their way to Berlin between the end of the 19th century and the 1930s. And the city reflected that. It was pretty cosmopolitan, unlike many other parts of Germany. So it had that thing, and it was 4 million people, not by and large Nazi voters. I mean, there's a bit of a myth about Berlin being left-wing and democratic and so on. It's true up to a point, but you must remember, and the same was true when the communists took over in a different way, that yes, there were rebels, yes, there were Democrats, yes, there were people who loved freedom and wanted to keep hold of their freedom, but there were also those big suburbs, particularly to the southwest and parts of the east, where the civil servants and the industrial managers and so on lived, who tended to be pretty right wing, actually. So Berlin was a real mix between the working class suburbs, particularly, were pretty restive, and they were either communist or social democrat almost until the time when Hitler took power. But these other parts were not. They were bastions of reaction. I mean, Berlin was the capital, is where the power was. So a lot of people who wanted to wield power in Germany, if necessary in an authoritarian kind of way, went to live in Berlin. And the same was true under the communist regime later on. Yes, there was opposition to the communists in Berlin, in East Berlin, but also, again, all the Communist Party comrades who wanted to make something of themselves went to Berlin and tried to get government jobs there, and there were hundreds of thousands of them. So Berlin is kind of a more mixed, I think, than a lot of people give it credit for.
Mm. So let's begin with not to begin, but let's and it's a kind of begin the story with the Soviet invasion because, like you said, it was kind of compensation for the Soviet Union that they would, and as you know, the Churchill famously drew a line in a napkin where, okay, you got this side of Europe, and
Mhm.
then we get the rest. So it was kind of pre-decided, and even if Stalin won, he
Berlin,
wanted the whole Berlin, and we'll come back to this, of course, in later on that he wanted the whole Berlin, and of course, in the missile crisis, this was came up as well. But let's begin with the Soviet invasion of Berlin. And talk a
there was
little
a
bit
lot
about
of
this. Yeah.
there was disagreement among the in Western Allies in 1944, early 45, about whether they should, in fact, make a move on Berlin. The Russians were approaching from the east, obviously, and the Western Allies from the west. Um, they could theoretically have pushed through and taken Berlin before the Russians managed to arrive, because the Germans were putting up quite a sturdy resistance, actually, in the eastern part of Germany, after the front had collapsed in 44, but their resistance stiffened at the beginning of 1945. The Americans basically didn't want to do it. They weren't bothered. They Eisenhower, the American commander and overall commander of the Allied forces, didn't think that it was worth taking Berlin. It had no real strategic value. That's a moot point. Churchill wanted to do it. He wanted to hold Berlin as a bargaining chip and make sure the Russians didn't scoop the whole thing, which they were liable to do if and when they took it. In the end, Churchill was outplayed by Eisenhower, and Montgomery obviously was the British commander. He wanted to take Berlin as well. And so they agreed to let the Russians take Berlin. But they had already made an agreement that Berlin will be divided into first three British, Russian, and American sectors. And then when the British supported French demands for a presence in Berlin, and indeed in Western Germany as well, they gave them part of what was to be the British sector of Berlin. So there were four powers were supposed to divide Berlin up between them: Britain, France, America, and the Soviet Union. The question was, would the Russians honor that agreement, since they, for weeks after the end of the war, were basically in charge of Berlin and running it as a fiefdom of their own? And I should say, although the battle for Berlin was extremely bloody and both sides behaved extremely badly, Russian soldiers became notorious for raping German women during those weeks, and had been actually throughout the previous months in different parts of Germany. The Russians actually, and it's quite surprising when you consider how appallingly the Germans had behaved in Russia between 1941 and 1944. The Russians actually did organize provisions for the German population and didn't let them starve, and they didn't willfully destroy any of the infrastructure that helped the population to survive. They were not necessarily well behaved all the time, but they were, to my mind, better behaved than you could have reasonably expected. And so perhaps they thought, we'll make ourselves popular with the population, so they'll support us in owning the whole city. But that didn't happen. And in the end, the British and the Americans and the French were allowed to move into their sectors of Berlin. I mean, there were little holdups and so on, the usual Russian stuff of, oh, we got to repair a railway bridge, and suddenly, you can't go where you need to go. That was the traditional Russian excuse if they wanted to shut part of the Autobahn. But in the end, they did. And the British, I know for a fact, had to kick the Russians out of, or rather the Russians' communist German allies out of their sector, because they were pretty much setting up a block by block political control of the city, even though the British were supposed to be in overall charge. So there were tensions from the first, but it did actually settle down. And although the city was divided into these sectors for at least 2 or 3 years, there was relative quiet between them. You could move pretty freely between the sectors, and the city kept its integrity as one city at that point between 1945, 46, 47. After that, things changed, and really by then the Cold War had started. So we had the famous, notorious, I should say, Berlin blockade, where Stalin essentially tried to strangle Berlin and possibly, if he could, I'm sure he wanted to, force the Western Allies out of Berlin by basically stopping anything from.
Wasn't this the event that almost started World War III when the tanks were on the border of West and East Germany?
No, that's 61. This is 48.
Oh,
This is
right.
the earlier crisis, which led to the division of Berlin properly into East and West Berlin, with the East with the communist administration, including a German communist mayor, and West Berlin with a administration accepted by the Western Allies with a pro-Western, social democratic actually, mayor, Ernst Reuter. And what happened then, well, again, it was the classic thing. The Russians simply announced one day that the Autobahn and the railways were closed because of works, things that they had to do, repairs. And these repairs took almost a year. And so nobody could get in or out by land to Berlin. So then came in the famous Berlin airlift, where the city was supplied from the air for a year. I think a little bit less than a year, but almost a year. It was an amazing feat, and life was difficult, but people survived. The West Berliners did not starve. And this gave Berlin a flavor of East and West. So you now had East and West Berlin properly, with quasi patrolled. There were no barriers, but there were guards wandering around at the border between the two places. They were no longer one city properly from 1948 onwards. And then you had the creation, of course, of East and West Germany as separate states, sponsored by, respectively, the West. In the case of West Germany, where the capital was in Bonn, not Berlin. And then you had the East German state, which was set up shortly afterwards, which was under Russian sponsorship and which was based actually in East Berlin. So the whole thing took about 3 years until the genesis of, if not quite two states, certainly two entities that were hard to reconcile and where movement was difficult between them. By 1952, the East Germans had blocked off their entire western border with West Germany. Especially there was a fortified border going up from the south and Czechoslovak border up to the Baltic. And they'd already started stopping people from going between the places, but this really formalized it, and they evacuated whole villages so that the zone could be secure and so on. So, but they didn't do that with Berlin because it was under a different agreement. It was a military agreement between the four victorious allies, and it had a special status. So they left Berlin, West Berlin, in place as this weird kind of entity, which was basically supposedly run by the Allied military commissions, rather than being part of any supposed independent state. I mean, we had two supposed independent states. One was the Federal Republic of West Germany, and the other one was the Democratic Republic of East Germany. But Berlin, West Berlin certainly had a special status which protected it to some extent. And that's why when all those 2.5 million people, a lot of whom had got out in various other ways, but many, as the 50s progressed and things got tougher in terms of escaping from East into West Germany. Most people escaping from East Germany went through West Berlin. In other words, if you lived in, say, Frankfurt on the Oder or Dresden or Leipzig or somewhere like that, and you wanted to get out and go west, you had to take a train to Berlin, East Berlin. You then had to find a way of getting to the streets around the border between East and West Berlin, which, as I said, there was no wall yet, although there were patrols and there were problems. If you went, for instance, wandering along a street near the border between West and East Berlin with a suitcase, you might well find that the People's Police, that's the East German Vorpols, the People's Police, would pick you up and say, "What are you doing?" So people had to find ways of sneaking through while not arousing suspicion, and they did that in their tens and hundreds of thousands, because they were in many ways pretty desperate. And that's where you had the situation in 1960-61, particularly as 61 progressed and more rumors started getting around about how the East German state was becoming more repressive in terms of its attitude towards people leaving and so on. The number of people leaving increased. So the worse the situation got in East Germany, the more people were tempted to try and make the run into West Berlin. And from West Berlin, they then had to be evacuated to West Germany by air, because if they went by the permissive Autobahn route, which meant stopping at the border and having your passports checked and so on, they stood a chance of being arrested for what they called fleeing the Republic, Republikflucht. And that was a quite serious crime, and they would take you back into East Germany and stick you in jail. So you would find your way into West Berlin. There were various refugee camps, the biggest of which was Marienfelde. You would be interrogated, your stuff would be checked, and then they would offer you a flight to West Germany, where you'd be resettled and found a job and things like that. As I say, you wouldn't risk, if you were a recently fled East German, going along the Autobahn into West Germany, because you might well get picked up by the police. So all this was happening, and then as we got into July and August 1961, relations between between America particularly and Russia had deteriorated since the U-2 affair, basically, in 1960, when an American spy plane was shot down over Russia, piloted by a man called Gary Powers. And it caused a real deterioration in Russo-American relations, which was never really repaired while Eisenhower was still in office. When Kennedy was elected in November 1960 and became president in January 1961, any hopes that there might be an improvement were ruined by an attempted summit in the spring between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the Russian leader, in Vienna, which was a flop. And so the Russians were kind of looking for ways to annoy the Americans and make them look bad. And Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, was desperate to stem this hemorrhaging of people from his country. So the whole situation as regards a drastic solution, and the war was a drastic and expensive and difficult solution. How do you make a thing like that last? You have to build it, you have to man it, you have to supply it, and you have to put up with all the potential bad publicity that causes your country, which it did, of course.
So something I'm sorry for interrupting you, but
sure. No.
But I want to ask as well, because in Bridge of Spies, the movie, I'm sure you've seen it. We see in the West Berlin in 1959 that still a lot of ruins left from the war. And was this the case in real life as well, that there were still many ruins and these Dropnik people running the streets, and the crime gangs were roaming in East Berlin? Was this the case as we see in the movie?
I think, Yeah, well, I was there in 1965, and you could, yeah, there were a lot more ruins in East Berlin than West, it must be said. Um, the West Berlin had been rebuilt quite quickly with a lot of Western aid from America, particularly, to do that. Not necessarily attractively. I mean, West Berlin was not a particularly attractive city. It wasn't the historic center of Berlin, by the way. West Berlin has the Kurfürstendamm and things like that, but that's the Berlin of the early 20th century, really, suburban Berlin, if you will. Historic Berlin, when it was the Prussian capital in the 18th and 19th centuries, was mostly in East Berlin. So the attractive, if you will, a lot of the attractive parts anyway, of Berlin were actually in East Berlin. West Berlin, and they'd rebuild it. You have to find people somewhere to live. The Allied bombing had destroyed tens of thousands of homes and factories and so on in Berlin during the war. So you had to rebuild quickly. That's true throughout West Germany and elsewhere, actually. But you had to do it. And so West Berlin was not actually wildly attractive as architecturally. But East Germany, East Berlin rather, was still, there are a lot of bomb sites uncleared. There's a lot of rubble. There's a lot of places that had been rebuilt, had lots of anti-Western slogans on them. Like, for instance, I remember one, I think it was a government office block that had been rebuilt in East Berlin near the Leipzigerstrasse in the government district. And there was a little plaque on this thing saying destroyed by the terror bombers of Britain and America, 1943 or whenever it was, rebuilt with the aid of the glorious Soviet Union in like 1952 or whatever it was. So there was lots of that. Everything was propaganda, and everything could be blamed on the West because they had bombed Berlin so severely that only the Soviet Union could save them. But yeah, East Berlin was not wildly attractive. There was few new buildings, and because I mean, East Berlin, whatever its limitations, was a showcase compared with the rest of East Germany. Actually, it looked pretty good, even in the mid '60s. But no, it still had that element of slightly sad, ruined, destruction of past glories. There was that whole feeling. I wouldn't say there was a lot more crime. The crime really was in the desperation of the immediate post-war years and the lack of food, the lack of places to live. You had things like a big black market in all sorts of hard to get things in a rationed society where the currency was destroyed. That started to change in 1949 when they introduced the hard currency again, which was supported by the West, the Deutschmark. So all these things changed. I would say the 4 or 5 years after the war were riotously criminal in Berlin, as in many other German towns and cities at that time. But by the '60s, there were still signs of destruction and dilapidation and difficulty. But even East Germany itself, actually, people were certainly not starving. It was a very, to a Westerner, it was a very limited diet they had when you went to a restaurant or what have you. People wore, to my mind, dull, shabby clothes. I, at the time, when I went there in '65, had a sort of long Beatles haircut. You may not believe it now, but I did. And I was very much upbraided by an East German military officer in a restaurant where they took us. And so there was West Berlin was becoming, symbolically free, and I'll explain some of the reasons for that maybe in a bit later. East Berlin was strict. There was no real return to the kind of freedoms that the place had enjoyed until Hitler came to power in 1933.
If I may draw a comparison, it was kind of like I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a meme in the Barbie movie. It's kind of the happy place, and then the Oppenheimer movie, it's kind of the dark place. So it's kind of like where you have the one side is happy place, and then the one side you got, or like the Lion King movie, where that's the light you can't go to. But then the rest of the kingdom is yours. You know what I mean? It's the West Berlin was a happy place, and then there was East Berlin that was a dark place.
Yeah, I mean, East Berlin was literally dark. I mean, there really wasn't that much street lighting. And it wasn't for environmental reasons, it was because they didn't have it. See, East Germany had lost so many people and so on, but it also lost its main industrial areas. The eastern part of Germany, Silesia, which became part of Poland after 1945, had a lot of the coking coal that was the precious stuff that ran the big industrial steelmaking concerns and the big processing plants of the West. And all that they really had in East Berlin was lignite, which is a very dirty brown coal. And they had a shortage.
I bet the kids were wishing for coal for Christmas.
I beg your pardon?
I bet the kids were wishing for coals for Christmas.
Now, I remember actually in the 70s when I was studying in East Germany, they had a rhyme, and it was when I was in Potsdam, I think, which is just near Berlin. And in Potsdam at that time, you had the town, and then you had up on the hill above the town was the Russian garrison, where all the Russian troops stationed in the area were, and they were constantly having, brownouts. The electricity would go off for no apparent reason, but it never went off in the Russian part of town. And they had a rhyme that said, I won't put it in German. The Poles have the coking coal. Polen haben die Steinkohle, die Russen haben das Luft. Wir haben die French. Oh yeah, okay. It went, the Poles have the coking coal. The Russians have the light. They have all the lights on. We have their friendship, and that'll have to do us.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about as well, and you write about this as well, of course, that the recognition of East Germany and East Berlin was only recognized by the Soviet Union. So let's talk about why the West, why East Germany was not recognized by the Western world as well before we go into the building of the wall itself. So let's talk a little bit about recognition.
It was. I mean, East Germany was a dictatorship, but there's no question about it. There were good things about it: cheap rents, job security, free kindergartens. I mean, it was quite impressive for somebody from the West to see these things. But it was a dictatorship, and it had been imposed on a country without a peace treaty. We had to wait nearly 50 years for a formal peace treaty, and that was after the wall had come down. And the West Germans saw themselves as the democratic heirs to the Weimar Republic. In other words, they restored the freedom that Germany had had before Hitler came to power. And the East Germans had set up a dictatorship, and that was true. And so the West Germans basically looked upon themselves as the only legitimate Germany. because they had democratic elections. The East Germans did not have democratic elections. It was all fixed, basically. But it was rather like Ireland. After Irish independence in 1922, the Irish Independent Republic did not recognize what they called the Six Counties, the area that had remained part of Britain, Northern Ireland. And so anybody from Northern Ireland who wanted to claim Irish citizenship, even though they were technically speaking United Kingdom citizens, because it was still part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, could do so. And it was the same with East Germans and West Germany. Any East German who found their way by one route or another to West Germany, and even to West Berlin initially, and then into West Germany, could immediately claim West German citizenship, and all the rights and privileges and so on that came from that. So that was extremely tempting, and it was obviously part of a whole thing that was left over from the war and unresolved. I mean, I have to say, when I was in Germany visiting, I had my first 2 times in Germany before I even went to Berlin as a 17-year-old. I had a pen friend, and I visited him in Westphalia in West Germany. And I think it must have been 1963 when I was 15. And in the school, they still had a map of Germany as it had been in 1937, before the Second World War, showing what was now actually, in fact, part of Poland, as still part of Germany, and a big slogan saying, divided into 3, never, drei geteilt, niemals. And this was quite normal in West Germany. And that's why the East Germans saw the West Germans as revanchists, as people who wanted to restore some kind of fascist pre-war status quo. So it was an ideological and a national battle. I mean, people used to joke, actually, I remember in private conversation, at least, when thought nobody was listening, that really, if they could, the East German government would have liked to have renamed the German Democratic Republic the Central European Democratic Republic, just to get away from any idea of German nationalism. So, you know, that was a big thing. And building the Berlin Wall was intended, I think, to put these problems to bed, to say, okay, you don't like what we've got, we don't like what you've got, but you're going to have to put up with it. And it's not going to change. That was what the East Germans and their Soviet sponsors were saying when they built that wall in August 1961.
So let's talk about the building of the wall itself, because as I said, it was quite a dramatic event. And let's talk, and again, we see people escaping as the wall is being built, just trying to run across. And you mentioned, so I don't remember exactly when this was, but I remember there was this Russian, not Russian, but German defect soldier who defected that was captured in the perfect moment. That if you go to look at the,
he jumped,
and that's just an incredible photograph. If you go and look up German soldier defecting the Berlin Wall, it's an incredible photograph. But let's talk about because again, people jumping from rooftops, from windows, trying to escape the East Germany, and that's what. So let's talk about about this, because it's, like I said, it was quite really a dramatic event. You couldn't make it up.
No, they built the wall as quickly as they could, but you know, it was long. I mean, as I said, it was a total of 120 miles. What's that in kilometers? So nearly 200 kilometers of barrier. And there were, in fact, parts of the outlying parts of East Berlin.
And again, sorry for interrupting you again, but I want to know, do we have the financial plan of what the financial for the wall was? How much it cost to actually build this thing?
I don't know actually. I've never seen anything published about that. Um, they just commandeered everything. I mean, that's what communist states can do. If they set a priority, they may not be able to feed their populations properly and clothe their populations properly and build housing for them in the long term. But what they can do is if there's a crisis, then they will find the means. They will make that sacrifice, find the means, and do it because it's existential for the regime to make it work. So they, for instance, they accumulated all this immense amounts of barbed wire, which they had to keep outside of Berlin so that nobody spotted what might be going on, and only drive into Berlin when the actual day of the building of the wall, which in the first stages was not really a wall, actually, it was a barbed wire fence. And they had the army, they had the police, they had people who would do what they were told, the labor squads of laborers banging in posts and stringing along barbed wire, and they even had some workers battalions with machine guns marching around the Brandenburg Gate and showing that the workers supported the whole thing. That's what Stalinist regimes can do. That's what these kind of dirigist economies are for. They have big armies. They can surmount a crisis. When if you look at the way that the Russians won the Second World War, which they basically did on the Eastern Front, they got the whole place organized and won it. They essentially wrecked their economy in doing it, but that's never much of a calculation for these kind of regimes, and it wasn't
Mind if I ask?
war.
Mind if I ask, were there any workers since I kind of saw an opportunity and now I think I'm out of here. I'm gonna go to West
Where the
Berlin
what?
now.
Sorry.
Were there any workers that worked on the wall that actually kind of thought that, hey, this might be an opportunity. I'm just gonna leave my spade and everything and just
Probably
go to
one or
West
two. I think
Berlin?
one or two did actually. Yeah, just as that border guard did. When he leapt over the wire and escaped into the West. But it's a mistake to think the East German regime had no support among the population. I would think, I always got the impression about 15 to 20% supported it quite strongly, actually. Life was secure. There were not going to be any return to Nazism. Workers were respected, so it felt. There was cheap accommodation, good education to a degree, security, economic security, on a relatively low base, but nevertheless, compared with the kind of poverty, say, that some of them would still remember from the 1930s, or had heard about from their parents. So yeah, there was a fair amount of support, and I think it's only as the wall cut the country off completely from the West and made in other words, you would never have a choice of going to the West if you wanted to, that this sort of form of claustrophobia, which I certainly felt when I spent the weeks and months I spent in East Germany in the 1970s, certainly felt. This kind of claustrophobia, I think, had a bad long-term effect on morale in East Germany. So the regime solved its problem in one way by building the wall, and in another way, it increased its long-term problem because it was basically putting its population in a cage. I mean, saying you can't go anywhere, particularly since, and this is the weird thing, it's relatively easy to cut off somewhere like Poland or Hungary or Slovakia or wherever, because you're in this cage, and it's you as a nation all speaking the same language with things in common, are all in the same boat. Excuse me, in this captive country. But the thing is, if you're an East German, you know you can go over that border into West Germany. You speak the same language. You probably have relatives there. It's a wholly different psychological
Effects.
mindset than you have if a whole country is captured and kept captive. You're all in it together. In case of Germany, we were not all in it together. Anything could happen, and your life could be very different if only you could get across the border and go somewhere better with people who speak the same language and have basically the same culture as you. It's that's why, of course, after the wall was built, the East German government, who were not stupid, increased the number of consumer goods being produced in factories and made a concerted effort to compensate for the claustrophobia of being stuck in this country and with no way of getting out. A way of compensating for that by an increased standard of living. Simple things, a fridge, and maybe a car. You might have to wait years for it, but you might get a car finally. Better clothes, a little bit better food. This kind of thing went on after the wall was built because these were not stupid people. They were limited in their understanding of the world, so it seemed to us in the capitalist West. But they were not stupid, and they knew they had to placate their population somehow, keep them happy or as happy as was possible under the circumstances.
How were refugees welcomed by the local Berliners in West Berlin? Because we're going to talk about as well, and after the wall was being built, how they found so many creative ways in trying to escape the east. But how were refugees welcomed by local Berliners? Did they feel like they were coming in and taking jobs and push like a lot of people do today? That immigrants, they make the rent go up and etc. Was it the same mindset back then?
On the one hand, they were kind of heroes for escaping. On the other hand, I think there's a friend of mine. Sadly, he died a few years ago. Who was one of the first people in 1960 to come across from his home in Thuringia and flee into West Berlin. But he didn't want to go to West Germany. He ended up staying in West Berlin and got a factory job. And the attitude among his fellow workers was pretty much, what are you doing here?
That we're holier than thou kind of thing.
Yeah, he was called Saxon Scheißer, shitty Saxon. And they mocked his accent and all the rest of it. I mean, it took quite a while to sort of get people to accept him. I mean, the same thing that happened when all those Germans fled from the Eastern territories at the end of the Second World War into Western Germany, from Prussia, from Silesia, all those places that were conquered by the Russians and given to Poland. They were called Ivans and Polacken and all these things by the local Western, often Catholic, where most people from the East were Protestant. This stuff went on. It wasn't much publicized, but it did go on. I mean, West Germany had already accepted millions of refugees from the East in the late 40s, and now had to put up with more. It needed it. I mean, the German economy was expanding, and the people who came from East Germany before the wall was built, and in the immediate time after, when a few thousand still managed to get out, were accepted and needed. In fact, it's very interesting that after the wall was built, pretty shortly after that, I think it was the next year, the West German government made its first agreement with Turkey to bring in guest workers to West Germany to work in German factories. And that's because the supply of new cheap labor from East Germany had been cut off by the building of the wall. So looked at unsentimentally, this was quite complicated. You're quite right to point at the fact that it wasn't uncomplicated, the attitude of Western Germans towards the East.
I just want to point out that I'm not anti-immigration, by the way, but I'm just pointing out how to compare how some people feel about immigration. To do an example about how I'm not by any means anti-immigration, but as well, but I want to know whether some people that were sent back to East Germany, if they were able to escape,
With what?
were there ever anyone that were sent back to East Germany if they even if they escaped to the West, and there's someone able to escape, were they sent back to, or were there, is there any instances of this?
I think some did go back, actually. Some found life in the West actually tough. You know, the ruthless competition of capitalism, the price of everything, the loss of the kind of social security that they had experienced in a communist state, which is, you know, an important factor in people's lives, meant that some people couldn't actually manage living in the West and went back. They were often punished as a result, but they did do it. And of course, some West Germans went to the East. The singer Wolf Biermann was one. Angela Merkel's father was another. Angela Merkel was born in Hamburg in West Germany, but her father, who was a church minister, decided to go and live in East Germany, not just because the Lutheran Church needed people to go there, but because he actually had a certain amount of interest in and respect for, you know, the socialist system in the East. So nothing is ever black and white, nothing is ever simple. In terms of East Germany didn't have that many immigrants. There were some. There were some Yugoslavs, Bulgarians. I remember a few, and Vietnamese came in the 70s. You know, to work because they had a labor shortage, just like the West Germans did. Because East Germany was, by the 70s, briefly at least, fairly successful economically, and certainly compared with the rest of the Soviet bloc. So that it had the same problems and some of the same solutions. But I mean, it wasn't. The immigrant population in East Germany wasn't in any way comparable with the number of Turks, Yugoslavs, and so on who came into the German labor market, the West German labor market, in the 60s and 70s. I remember whole train loads coming in to Stuttgart station from Yugoslavia, and they'd all get out. They'd all been home for the holidays, or they're coming to work in West Germany, and it was a big thing. I mean, it was a continuation of what had happened during the Second World War. Second World War, there were millions of foreign workers working in Hitler's Germany. It wasn't racially pure in the way that people imagine.
How were you viewed as a Westerner studying in East Berlin? What was there? Did you feel any prejudice, or did you feel how were you viewed as a Westerner in Berlin?
People were pretty friendly. They were cautious. I mean, I remember the archives as a history student. I was visiting archives looking for documentation for my PhD thesis, and I spent some time in Potsdam, where the archive for the pre-1918 government was, and then some other time in Merseburg in the eastern part of south and eastern part of East Germany was. In both cases, the staff in the archives were cautious. They were friendly, but very cautious. I think some Western academics had let them down. I remember there was a case of a Western academic who's dead now, but I won't mention his name, who had some kind of quite sort of boozy dinners with the archive staff, where they had actually expressed their real opinions about the government in East Germany. Not necessarily completely disapproving, but probably a bit disrespectful, and a few jokes were made and things like that. And he wrote a newspaper article along these lines. He didn't name any names, but then he didn't need to. The East German secret police would have been perfectly well aware who he'd been seeing and who he must have got these information from. And that meant, I think, this was a few years before I was there in the early 70s. So I think people were cautious. The other thing is that there was a thing in East Germany called intershops. Intershops were stuff selling Western goods, which you could only buy with Western currency in East Germany.
Mm.
People could buy stuff for their West Germans visiting East Germany could buy stuff for their relatives there and give them, I don't know, coffee pots or TV sets or what have you. And there was often a slight feeling that people wanted you to do them a favor. If you have some Western money, would you be prepared to kind of, if they gave you such and such, could you get them a thing that was only available at the intershop? So the relationship you had was slightly kind of colored by this constant feeling. But yeah, people were pretty friendly. No, I don't remember any hostility at all, actually. A couple of Russians working in the archives were a bit stiff, but no, the East Germans were friendly but cautious, I would say.
Hmm. Now, something you write about as well is that, of course, you mentioned that the price currency and everything was a little bit cheaper in East Germany. So, so of course, and for the Western Berliners, they would occasionally come and visit and try to buy some rarities in East Berlin and bring. Sometimes they would bring the rare LP records that they could find cheap in East Germany, or stuff that they couldn't find would have been tremendous expensive in West Germany compared to East. So was this some? Do you talk a little bit about this in the book as well? So was this a little bit risky business? Let's say if I wanted to buy a rare LP record and I wanted to bring it back to West Berlin, how risky was this? A risky business, and how?
No, I mean,
how did this go?
Yeah, if you bought something, you could bring it back. I mean, there's no question about that. You're not allowed to bring money back. You had to exchange a certain amount of money, and that money you had to spend. If you didn't spend it, they would confiscate it on the way out. So you would buy they were particularly good on classical records, actually, classical music. But you certainly wouldn't want to be caught smuggling stuff in there and trying to sell it. I mean, kids, you could have sold the jeans that you were wearing any day of the week. People would sort of, you could tell they were lusting after your Levi's, which were much better quality than what you would get in East Germany. So that did go on, but it was more. I don't think I certainly never risked it, because who needs the trouble? I mean, they probably just kick you out.
Yeah.
I had, not rather than put you in jail, but I mean, I didn't want to be kicked out. I had work to do. So this stuff went on. It was it was part of everyday life. The government sort of knew about it, but unless it was outrageous and obvious and bad for morale because of that, I think they pretty much tolerated it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the East German communist officials' kids, were also lusting after pairs of, genuine Levi's from America, and would have been up to the similar kind of tricks, trying to get hold of a pair, as anybody else. The place was claustrophobic, but it didn't feel inhumane as long as you didn't get involved with the secret police for any reason. It wasn't a terrible place. It wasn't, as Katia Hoy has pointed out, she's written a wonderful book about East Germany and born in East Germany herself. If you kept your nose clean in East Germany, it wasn't a bad life. And if you could put up with the confinement, with not really being able to go anywhere apart from maybe a beach in Bulgaria or what have you, for your holidays, then it was kind of okay, you know.
Were there corruption among the border guards as well? That among the east and western border guards, were there corruption if you, let's say, had something that weren't 100% legal that you brought over to the west or to the east? Should you
Oh,
pay off the guards?
I don't know about that. I certainly never tried. As I said, I have work to do. I certainly never tried anything like that.
I mean, in generally, were there corruption in among the border guards in?
I don't think so, actually, because they were pretty strict. I mean, I doubt it, actually. And the corruption that happened was much higher level than that. And I'm sure, I think there probably was corruption at the very highest level because a great deal of Western money was sloshing around in East Germany um, over the years. And but on a regular basis, I really don't think so. I mean, you were always, the East German border guards were rarely alone. The places where you might have been able to effectively bribe them to do something, there were usually too many of them around, unless you bribed them all at once, which I doubt you would. I'm sure it went on, but I certainly never had any suspicion that might be the case, except for common sense telling you these things almost always do when you have a repressive system, that money changes hands to gain privileges within that system. But I don't know. In other words,
Now, we talked a little bit about escapes from the east to the west earlier, but I want to go back again to this point because, as I said, it's an important part of the book. So that when the Berlin Wall was built and people had, it was, needless to say, more difficult to escape the east, people still found ways to, by digging tunnels and like we mentioned earlier, jump from the roof. So let's talk about the more creative ways that people, like you said, the U-Bahn was, of course, almost impossible to get through.
oh,
But let's
yeah.
talk about the escape routes that people use to run away from. And of course, if you were caught aware, occasionally how often did bodyguards murder the escape maybe
I
the
think
victim is not the right word, but were the
a little,
murders that
yeah.
went on?
It was awful when it happened, but actually it didn't. It happened a lot in the early years, relatively speaking. But actually, we're talking about somewhere between 100 and 200, depending on how you classify people being killed. Some people tried to
Still
swim and
quite a
get
high
off.
number.
It is quite a high number, but then it's 28 years that the thing was in existence. No, it's terrible. I mean, people shouldn't be treated like that, and it's just awful. But the boys, and they usually were boys, East German boys, they were conscripts, would be severely punished if they didn't say. If they saw somebody trying to escape and did not shoot at them, they would be in deep, deep trouble. They could end up in jail themselves. So generally speaking, they did shoot at would-be escapees. I mean, you had people, the tunnels, which really the first 2 or 3 years after the wall was built, were a major means of escape. You had people ramming the
If
wall.
I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but if you visit Berlin today, can you see some of these tunnels that were built today? Are they available to? Can you still see them?
I'm not sure, actually. It's quite possible that you can. There were a couple of very famous tunnels, one of which was filmed who was part financed by an American, I think it was NBC, an American broadcaster, in 1962, I think it was. It's quite possible that there still are remnants of these things. I know they still find tunnels that were abandoned or discovered because the East German authorities figured out to use kind of X-ray and a form of ultrasound to see if anything was going on below the surface at the border. And so it became harder to build tunnels without them being detected by the East German authorities. And then you have people flying over, you have people trying to hijack airplanes, you have people building improvised aircraft to take them over, you have people firing cables and then using them to swing your way over into the west. The tall building of the old air ministry, which had been the headquarters of Hermann Goering, the Nazi leader of the Luftwaffe in the Second World War, was right by the border. And they managed, a small group managed to stay in the building after it shut at night. And as I said, then fire this harpoon-like thing over into the west and just bring themselves over, hanging from the wire and into the west. And people were incredibly ingenious. I mean, it's extraordinary. But as the years went on, this became more and more difficult. But you know, the things became stricter. The authorities got cleverer and had more technology to detect these things, and they had, of course, an enormous expansion of the Stasi, the secret police, after the wall was built. And that had an effect too, because it was very hard to keep an escape plot secret, because the Stasi were everywhere and they had tens of thousands of so-called unofficial co-workers, as they call it, inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, who were essentially paid agents, often related to people or friends of people. People found out after the wall came down that, for instance, their wife or husband had been spying on them and reporting to the authorities. So it became extremely difficult to escape in any of those interesting, and to us as outsiders who are looking for an adventure to read about, what was very interesting to us, these methods became more and more difficult to make work. And so people had to find other methods, often involving false papers and getting out through a third country, whether it's Czechoslovakia into Bavaria, or actually that was the most common one, or into Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia was semi-detached from the Soviet Empire by the 1960s. So if you could get into Yugoslavia, you could probably find your way through to Greece, or maybe across the Adriatic to Italy, or into Austria, or what have you. So people started using other methods to get out than simple escape methods of physically getting yourself from East into West Berlin. And these things became much more common as the 70s and 80s progressed.
I remember you talking about in the book that I think it was a film episode that it was when it came to the secret police, that it mentioned that there was two people who joined the crew, and one of them that it thought were the betrayer was actually not the one who betrayed them, but the other guy that didn't seem so innocent, that he was the one who betrayed. So there was a lot of, even inside the gangs, you had people betraying each other because they were working for secret police or working for the state.
Well, you never knew. I mean, to an outsider going to East Germany in the 70s, as I did for quite considerable length of time, relatively speaking, a few months, as I said, it didn't seem that bad. But I think if you were part of that society and had any doubts or wanted, say, to leave, I think you could easily feel pretty damn paranoid about who you could tell, who you could involve in your plot. I mean, it was very rare for people to do something on their own. I mean, you had to have collaborators. If you had false papers, you had to get the false papers or somebody who could forge them or what have you. I mean, it did get a lot more difficult. I mean, by the mid 70s, I would say the vast majority of East Germans who ended up in the West were not part of an escape plot. They had somehow been sold. Do you know this thing about being sold to the West?
Yeah.
What followed through in the 70s was that a lot of the people who got into the West were basically trafficked by the East German government. The East German government by the 70s had decided, okay, if there are certain people who really don't want to stay here, we might as well make some money out of them. So if, for instance, you applied for an exit visa, which you technically could always apply for an exit visa to Germany, nothing to stop you doing that, although you would, of course, be suspected of being disloyal. But in the 70s, you would start getting situations where people would apply for an exit visa, and then this would be refused, and they would then find themselves weeks or months later being arrested for some real or imagined crime, put in prison, and then offered basically to the West as a hostage for often tens of thousands of marks in Western hard currency, which of course all East Germany, like all communist states, was desperate for hard currency from the West. And this became such a big thing that, I mean, basically billions of Deutschmarks were earned by the East German state in selling East German would-be refugees and dissidents to the West in the last 15 or so years of the regime before the wall came down. It's a remarkable thing, actually. That's what I mean about all this Western money sloshing around in the East German system, and that's where probably the room was for the corruption, rather than simply crossing a border guard's hand with a fistful of Deutschmarks. I don't think that happened much because the stakes were too high and the payment too low. But I think there was huge amounts of money sloshing around in the upper echelons of the East German government in the last 15 or 20 years of the regime, some of which still hasn't been accounted for, actually.
Hmm. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, of course, because Berlin would be essential. No, maybe not essential, but it would be an important part, as I mentioned earlier, in about the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, because under the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were worried in the White House that Khrushchev would, or Khrushchev, I don't know if that, whatever the right pronunciation for him is, but there was worry that he wanted to swallow Berlin as a whole and take the entire city. So let's talk a little bit about the paranoia of Berlin during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, I mean, it was obvious that the one thing you would worry about if you were American is you got these missiles being set up in Cuba. What is really going on here? What do the Russians want? Is this some kind of distraction? And if it isn't, are the Russians then, while you're trying to get them to remove these missiles from Cuba, suddenly say, undertake some drastic action in Berlin to really cut the place off from, they closed the autobahns again, for instance, as they had in 1948, with and try and starve the West Berlin population out, and then do a deal with the Americans about Cuba, or you never knew what the Russians were going to do. Cuba was kind of a weird thing. I mean, the Russians must have known that the Americans wouldn't put up with nuclear missiles on their doorstep. I mean, 90 miles from Key West. But they did it. But they didn't appear to get anything from it. I mean, it is surprising that they didn't use the Cuban crisis more skillfully, the Russians actually, because they could have got concessions over Berlin, or they could have, as a result of, as a price. I mean, in the end, there was a secret deal between Russia and America whereby the Russians removed their missiles from Cuba, and the Americans then removed their missiles from Turkey. which represented a near threat to that part of the Soviet Union. But it's kind of it's for something that, and I can remember it quite vividly. I was 14 at the time. For such a big, dangerous thing, the Cuban crisis, it's amazing that it didn't lead to more than it didn't lead to anything. It didn't lead to anything apart from, I think, both sides realizing that they did not want a nuclear war, which is something, I suppose, that's important. But I don't think the Russians didn't really exploit the crisis in a clever way. And I think that's one reason why 2 years later, Khrushchev was deposed, because I think people were still resenting the Cuban Missile Crisis and the waste of effort and humiliation, in fact, it implied for Russia when they failed to make the Americans make concessions that were the kind of spectacular win that most people in the Russian leadership would have expected from a major psyop, if you will, like that.
Is there any chance that Khrushchev could have negotiated himself into swallowing up, so to speak, the entire Berlin? Or is there any Is there any way that Khrushchev could actually have gotten the entire Berlin if he tried, or is it kind of unrealistic to think that
it is impossible? It's impossible to tell because he didn't. It's interesting that when the wall was built, the Western powers, Britain, France, and America, protested, but in a quite a low-key way. I mean, it wasn't like they said, either you tear this thing down or we fight you. Nothing like that at all. They were very concerned not to turn it into a military crisis, which could lead, in effect, to a third world war. And it was the most important thing. I think the point is that the Russians knew, I think, that none of the Western powers really cared about Germany and Berlin as such. They were quite happy with the division of Germany. There was still plenty of feeling in Britain and France especially, but also to some extent in America, that, okay, let's keep Germany weak, and keeping Germany divided keeps it weak. I mean, a French politician, the disagreements about which one it exactly was, said at the time, oh yeah, he said, you accuse us of not liking Germany. Well, I like Germany so much, I want two of them. That was, pretty much the attitude. So there's an element of shadow boxing about the entire Berlin crisis. Nobody really was going to push it that hard. Ulbricht would have. Ulbricht wanted West Berlin desperately, but the Russians didn't let him have it because it wasn't that important to them. And it was quite nice for them to have the West sitting there in West Berlin where you could make trouble for them anytime you wanted. And where you actually had a stake in the place. Because technically speaking, West Berlin, I mean, Russian troops could walk into West Berlin anytime. Any troop, any soldier of any of the four allies in uniform could go into the Russian zone of Berlin, and any Russian soldier could go into any of the sectors of West Berlin in a way that had been agreed at the end of the war, when it was still pretty much one city before it started to divide in 1947, 48. So the wall itself, the big thing, the big confrontation that occurred in October 1961 and the Friedrichstrasse, the Checkpoint Charlie crisis with American and Soviet tanks facing each other across the border, which everybody saw as a potential flashpoint for a world war, only occurred and this was 2.5 months after the building of the wall, to which the Allies had made quite feeble protests, because American and Russian prestige was involved. Nobody wanted to back down because they didn't want to be embarrassed. So it was a matter of prestige, and that might have started the Third World War, but it had, in a sense, nothing to do with the wall. It had to do with two big, powerful nations squaring up to each other, and almost getting into a fight with each other, and then deciding not to, and finding a way of backing down, which would embarrass neither of them, and they did in the end. Again, a back channel was established through the United Nations in New York, and they agreed that they would find some excuse to back down. I can't remember exactly what it was now, but that's the only time I think we came close to a nuclear war over Berlin, was to do with the military prestige of the two greatest powers, Russia and America.
Mm. So, of course, one of the things we have to talk about, of course, is the Kennedy visit to Berlin, and of course, the famous where he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." So let's talk about the famous Kennedy visit to Berlin, and of course, his I do believe Lyndon B. Johnson as well, of course, visited the Berlin as well. So let's talk a little bit about the Kennedy and Johnson, because he visited on a different occasion. But let's talk. Let's talk about the both visits.
Johnson came almost immediately after the wall was built as a gesture that showed American solidarity.
He didn't seem too pleased to be to
he
go.
wasn't. He wasn't, apparently. No, he didn't want to go there. He didn't like traveling much apart from anything else. But he did. He did it in the end. He had to do it. They persuaded him to do it. And he showed up, and he was big, and he was American, and he looked like a cowboy. And I think the West Berliners were comforted by the fact that he was there. Kennedy was a different thing. Kennedy was June '63. I mean, that was nearly 2 years later. And that was a big thing. Kennedy was glamorous. And again, it was a symbolic support for West Berlin's status. I don't think West Berlin was feeling as threatened in 1963 as it had done in the immediate aftermath of the wall being built. But, like that. His famous speech, there's the famous "Ich bin ein Berliner" quote. And yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this. It's a fine point of German grammar, actually, because there are two things. A Berliner is obviously somebody from Berlin, but it's also a kind of jam donut. So some people say, well, he should have said, obviously somebody, German-speaking member of his staff, had written this line for him. He should have said, "Ich bin Berliner," to say I'm a Berliner, because you don't. Ich bin Nürnberger, ich bin Kölner, ich bin Berliner is how you would normally introduce yourself if you wanted to say you came from a place. Whereas Kenny's "Ich bin ein Berliner," which some people claim makes it sound like I'm a jam donut. But actually, I don't quite come down on that, because I think Kennedy was really saying, I am a Berliner, emphatic. Now, for instance, if you had somebody saying, I'm an actor, for instance, a stage or film actor, they would say, "Ich bin Schauspieler." Schauspieler is an actor in German. And however, you could still say, Ich bin ein Schauspieler, if you were emphasizing the fact that you're an actor. So don't talk to me about acting. I'm an actor. I know what acting is all about. That sort of emphasis.
Ich bin ein Historiker.
Exactly. But you would say also ich bin Historiker. But you could say ich bin ein Historiker if you were really emphasizing the fact that you're a historian, so don't mess with it. And I
Oh
think
no, I wouldn't.
it's boring. It's boring. It's boring. I like the story about the jam donut. It's funny. But I think on the whole, I'm disappointed to tell you. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was the person who wrote the line for him was German born and pretty much bilingual. So I'd be very surprised if they had made a mistake.
So let's talk about as the years go on, about the 70s and 80s, and the world is still there. How do people eventually just kind of diffuse it, and how, as the years go on, how does the escape attempt just become less and less, or are there still several people? The early escapes is mostly in the earliest phase of the war, or is there still throughout the war's lifespan? Is there still escapees that try to constantly try to escape to West Berlin?
People got used to it. I mean, in East and West. I mean, in the times I was in Berlin in the 70s, which was fairly often. You just got used to it. It just once you've been there for a while, coming around the corner and then suddenly seeing this wall here, and then you go along it and go off to wherever you're off to, became sort of normal. As I say, claustrophobic in its way, but normal. The thing about the people who lived in Berlin in the 70s and 80s is that they were by and large either old pensioners who didn't want to move out of the city they'd lived in all their lives, or students and draft dodgers. If you lived in West Berlin, which you could move to freely from West Germany, and were in fact encouraged to do so because they didn't want the place to become depopulated because of its isolation, you avoided the West German military draft. The Bundeswehr was still a conscript army until the 1990s, I think. And so you had a lot of alternative types and left wingers and artistic types. Accommodation was cheap. So you put up with the inconveniences and the embarrassment. And some people were more sympathetic to the East and liked to go over there and so on. It all became normalized.
I'm sorry, mind if I just interrupt you for a second? Just 5 seconds. So yeah, we're talking. We're back, and we were talking about how people were avoiding draft results, drafting to the army by moving to West Berlin, and how life went on as the wall kind of just stood there in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, West Berlin could not have existed without huge financial support, mostly from West Germany, because they'd lost a lot of the industries that they had had, certainly before the war, and then later into the 40s and 50s and early 60s, because of the autobahns being blocked off and the rail system being dependent on the East Germans allowing it to go through their territory and so on. So that's why the population of West Berlin tended to be either young or elderly, because pensioners obviously didn't need a job. They would simply be paid and have their flat that they lived in all their lives and so on. So huge numbers of people, the sort of people who have jobs and families and all that, were in very short supply in West Berlin. It was limited, the ambitions you could have if you had a job in West Berlin. And those jobs were not secure because they were tending to drain away into the main West German country, simply because it was a better place to situate these factories and offices and so on. Why would you put them in West Berlin? It's this island surrounded by communism, whose supply lines can be cut off at any moment. where if you say produce something, you manufacture something, how do you get it out of there? How do you export it to West Germany and the rest of the world? It was tricky. So the place was in effect subsidized in its survival. I mean, I think one of the things that the East Germans particularly had hoped is that if you place a city like West Berlin in the situation of being surrounded by a fortified wall and with supply lines that can be cut off at any time, it will simply wither away and finally surrender and say, well, we don't really want to be part of East Germany. We can't go on living like this. That didn't happen, but that was the hope that they had. And the reason it didn't happen was because of this vast amount of government welfare that was directed at West Berlin by the West German government in the nearly 30 years after the wall was built. It's something actually, by the way, that after the wall came down, Berlin suddenly lacked. I mean, they suddenly didn't have the industries and so on. They didn't have the government subsidies either. So that's why Berlin in the 1990s was basically pretty much bankrupt. But it was a showcase. East Berlin was a showcase too. East Berlin wasn't fabulous, although they'd restored a lot of the historic buildings very well, actually. And there were restaurants, there were theaters, there were cinemas, and so on. And they'd done their best to make it look smart. As you got towards the outskirts of, say, East Berlin, it looked pretty shabby. You would find houses that hadn't been painted and with cracks in the plaster, and it was pretty depressing once you got outside the middle of it. But the middle of East Berlin was a showcase, and they were, this battle of the two showcase cities between the two systems of East and West, with the capitalists trying to show that they were the best, and the communists saying, well, look, we're pretty good too. Look at this. This is a fine city here. Again, the shadow boxing. There is increasingly a feeling of shadow boxing as you go on through the 70s and 80s, as if this is all here because of the conflict, because of the Cold War, because East is confronting West, and they don't want a war, but they don't want to give in to each other either. The East did in the end collapse, but until they did, these two cities, West Berlin on the one side, East Berlin on the other, sat there and sense glowering at each other and saying we're the best, and the other one saying no, we're the best. There was something slightly ridiculous about it, actually.
So let's talk about the collapse of the Berlin Wall itself, because that's kind of, as well, like that we talked about in the building of the wall, it's also a quite dramatic event. Sure. That took place in '89, and when you see, and I remember my grandparents were watching a TV. I don't remember what it's called, but they were watching a TV program. I think it was a German show where they depicted the event of and how the people working in the middle of the night, and how they went out when the Berlin Wall. It was not a documentary; it was a fictional TV series, but still, it depicted the fall of the wall. And again, I'm sure you can see videos on YouTube or wherever you can find of the event taking place, and it's quite fascinating to watch how the Berlin Wall came. So what did cause that finally people were fed up with this wall that blocking both East and the West, and how did they finally come to the conclusion, and were they kind of planned event, or did just people kind of randomly pour into and begin to hammer on the wall? And how did the guards begin to react, the border guards? How did they react in the beginning when people were starting to like, we're done with this, we want this down?
Well, throughout 1989, I mean, to some extent it started earlier on, but mostly certainly throughout 1989, there'd been more and more pressure for people to be able to travel out of East Germany and go and visit places, to visit relatives in the West and so on. And the government had started to kind of weaken in that regard. The firm grip of the East German government had started to weaken. Then, of course, the Russian side of things was such that there was all this stuff going on between Reagan and Gorbachev, and then George Herbert Bush when he became president, and the government in East Germany, which but now it's a long story, but basically was no longer supported by Gorbachev, who saw them as a bunch of cement-headed old Stalinists, was starting to think we have to make allowances, but they wanted to keep control, but they wanted to allow people to apply to go abroad with some kind of possibility that they might have their request accepted. People had always been able to apply, but they probably wouldn't have their request accepted. And even if they did, it might lead to consequences. Why do you want to leave, for instance? And then they might get put in jail or fined or whatever, or lose their jobs or all that kind of thing. So they basically wanted to do something about that. But meanwhile, their hand was being forced by the fact that other places like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and to some extent Poland were liberalizing fast. The East German regime, which was the most sort of neo-Stalinist of them, was reluctant to do so and was resisting it. But for instance, the main thing happened in May 1989 when the Hungarians, who had always been a very liberal communist regime by comparison with others, decided they would actually open the border between Hungary and Austria. In other words, they would remove the fortified border and allow a normal border between the two countries. Once they did that, it was the end, because there's nothing to stop East Germans jumping in their little Trabants or Wolfsburgs or whatever they were, their little cars, and driving down to Hungary, which was a neighboring friendly socialist state, and then going to the border and walking over into Austria. And from there, of course, they could go anywhere they wanted. And there was the famous picnic where hundreds of people from East Germany gathered at the border and had something of a picnic. And again, as I say, then they just walked over the border into the West. And once you allowed that people could do that, unless you had alternatives. You could either, as in 1961, cut the country off from the surrounding communist countries now, not just from the West, but from the surrounding communist countries that were liberalizing. Or you had to find some way of controlling this exodus, because an exodus was going to happen now, because this hole had appeared in the Iron Curtain. And if people couldn't get through the wall in Berlin, they would simply go south and walk across the field and into the forest, and then through into Austria via Hungary. And so that's what happened. And in early November, the Politburo, that's the sort of central committee of the Communist Party in East Germany, Socialist Unity Party rather, I suppose, but Communist Party basically, was trying to figure out how to allow travel but keep control of it. And they put out their representative gave a press conference and said that people would be allowed to apply for permission to leave East Germany in future, and the journalist said, "Well, when does that start applying?" And the guy looked at his piece of paper because they've all been a bit hurried. Nobody now was really figure out the exact wording. He said, well, as far as I can see, immediately. He meant you can start applying, going to a government office and applying to leave immediately. But people listening to that on the TV thought, okay, if I can leave immediately, I'm going to leave immediately. And they all started heading for the border. They didn't all, but large numbers of people started heading for the border. And they got to the Bornholmer Strasse, which was a major crossing between East and West Berlin. And basically a large crowd suddenly started demanding to be let through the gate to get through into West Berlin. Normally, of course, a few months earlier, this would have resulted in possibly bloodshed. I mean, it would have been unthinkable. But the regime was weakened. People knew that the restrictions, the travel restrictions were going to be liberalized. So why
Yes,
would you
and if I may, often has been compared at the end of '89 and like China at Tiananmen Square, Soviet Union has lost its
yeah.
grasp to the
Well,
kill and oppress
there were
crowds.
some extreme conservatives in the East German government who were still in favor of what they called the Tiananmen solution. Other words, due to people in East Berlin, what had been done to the students in Peking, but they were outvoted and actually pushed out of power quite soon afterwards. So, I mean, really, what happened then was basically the guy in charge, the colonel in charge of the border post, just opened the gates. So, okay, well, either we shoot these people or we let them through. And under the circumstances, with the regime in its weakened state and it becoming so obvious that soon these people will be able to travel anyway, so what was the point? And through they went into West Berlin, hundreds of them, and then eventually thousands, of course, and other checkpoints started doing the same thing. So it's the thing is, in West Berlin, in East Berlin, as in most parts of East Germany, you could watch West German TV. In other words, the regime couldn't keep a grip on information. If you were in Hungary or Poland or Lithuania or somewhere like that, all the media available to you were controlled by the communist government. So it was very hard to find out any information different to that which you were being fed by the communist government. In the case of East Germany, you watch West German TV. It was in German. You understood every word. So you couldn't keep anything really from people. You couldn't brainwash them in the same way that we would be able to do if you controlled all the media in that language in that place, as they did elsewhere in the Soviet bloc. So that was really what happened then, was the information spread like wildfire. It wasn't on East German TV that they were going to allow people to travel eventually. It was on West German TV, but everybody was watching West German TV. As everybody said, most East Germans were East Germans during the day and West Germans at night. In other words, they would watch TV in the evenings and become West Germans. I mean, it's a jokey way of putting it, but that was pretty much true. In fact, Dresden, which I also know quite a lot about because I've been there quite a lot, its situation in the Elbe Valley, quite far east in East Germany, was such that they had a great deal of difficulty receiving Western TV signals. And it was known in the rest of East Germany as the Valley of the Clueless, Tal der Ahnungslosen, because they had no idea what was going on. They could listen to the radio, they could get West German radio, so it wasn't entirely true, but they certainly couldn't get West German TV. So really, it was again, it was like this almost comical ease with which the regime fell. It was like a tiny push, if you will, and it was gone. It was like, the story, The Wizard of Oz. when they get in the almighty, fearful,
Yeah.
terrible sort of Oz, and they pull aside the curtain, and there's this little old
Just a
man.
little man, yeah.
Exactly, and it sort of felt like that. It was that one of those moments, I think, in history.
So let's talk about the aftermath of and the fall of communism, and of course the result, how the East would cope with. Because for some people, like I understand, it was very difficult to go from communism until
Oh,
capitalism. That suddenly you had all this welfare, you had a secure job, and of course the 90s for post-communist countries were notoriously bad. I made an episode on the Russia after the fall of communism from 19s until Putin, and we talked about how bad the 90s were in Russia. But
yeah.
again, I believe this is a general thing in post-communist countries that in what 90s was not a great time, and especially for
No, no,
Germans as well, who were had to deal with going from secure
I
job
agree.
and
Yeah.
pension to coming
It,
from the capitalist West. It was a difficult transaction for some people.
yeah, there's a narrative here which is tricky. Um, Many people claim, oh, we were forced to join up with West Germany. We didn't really want to. I don't know about that. I think there was a lot of excitement. It's funny because again, the same friend of mine who I talked about working in a factory in West Berlin after escaping from East Germany in the early 60s. He later made a career as a journalist, a television producer and presenter. And when the wall came down, he was actually in Poland because Chancellor Kohl, the leader of West Germany, was actually visiting uh, Warsaw at the time the wall came down. And as my friend Joachim Trenker put it, we suddenly realized wir tanzen auf der falschen Hochzeit. We were dancing at the wrong wedding. And they had to then commandeer a car, an old Polski Fiat, and head back to Berlin from Warsaw, which is a long drive through the night in this rackety old car. And he said, though, as you came back through East Berlin, and it was clear, he said, he turned to his fellow TV members of the TV crew and said, German reunification is here, because there was so much excitement and so on. Now that excitement, understandably, became tempered pretty quickly because
And
miracles.
so again, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but and it's funny that you should bring up the unification because I forgot to mention that weren't there some plan that by the end of the decade or something, so sorry, by the end of the century or something, that Germany would be reunified somehow, and it's fine. It actually came true that Germany was after 1989. It was indeed unified as a one
It
state.
could be. No. Um, I personally think it was eventually quite quickly inevitable, partly because East Germany itself, apart from its people who were, hardworking and creative and so on, had very few resources compared with West Germany, and which I think a lot of people quickly realized. And I really think that the East German population was very badly treated. I think they were not treated with respect. Their system was not respected. The good parts of their system were not recognized. What the things that they had cared about for so many years, in among all the things that they obviously disliked about their own regime and so on, and feared
You're
and
talking about,
all
of course, after the Berlin, after the fall of communism, not
after the wall
during.
came down,
Yeah, yeah.
was well, basically the West Germans moved in, took it over, uh, closed down all the unprofitable businesses, which was a very large number of businesses, because the East German economy had more or less functioned under socialist conditions, but under capitalist conditions, stood no chance whatsoever. Um, and hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people were thrown out of work. All the kind of benefits, the free kindergartens, the educational subsidies, the cheap rents, all the positive aspects of a socialist state rapidly also disappeared. So although they got terrific broadband and all the rest of it, and a lot of buildings were restored and so on and so on by the West Germans, pretty much, they lost an awful lot of things that were very important to them, that they suddenly realized that they missed these things, and that the kind of social system that they had worshipped from afar, looking at West Germany and its prosperity and so on, was not actually perfect. It was actually really difficult, particularly if you were in their position of having to build up a modern capitalist state from scratch in competition with the western part of the country. And I think that from that comes a huge amount of resentment. It's interesting, German politics in the last 30 years has slowly slid back into the Weimar Republic. In other words, you have a multi-party system. There used to be just 3 major parties in Germany, then 4. There was the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Free Democrats, liberals, and then eventually in the 70s into the 80s, the Greens became a major party. But now you have, the AfD as well, and the old Communist Party turned itself into a thing which had various names, eventually became the Left Party. And now you have a socially conservative Left Party under Sarah Wagenknecht. And you have a genuine, I think, far-right party, no matter what they say. It is a far-right party, there's no question about it. So in effect, you have a politics, mutatis mutandis, nothing is ever the same as it was before, but you have a party that looks remarkably in many ways like the political situation in Germany in, say, 1930, which is not a very, very hopeful thing. It's not a situation you really want, and not.
I mean, sorry for interrupting you again, but I want to talk about the AFD because you write about the AFD at the end of your. I think this is the latest edition of your book that you recently republished, and you talked about the AFD. Is it a danger for Germany if AFD? And as someone commented on my episode of Barbarossa, where we spoke about a little bit about the AFD at the end of the episode.
I don't know,
but is there a danger that the AFD ever will come to power? And if they do, is that a danger to Germany?
I think it depends which wing of the AFD comes close to power. As I said before, there is a wing that is more traditional national conservative, comparable perhaps with the German National People's Party, which was the conservative, relatively respectable conservative party during the Weimar Republic. And then you have a number of figures, particularly in Thuringia and Saxony, who are pretty much Nazis, as far as I can tell. They're racist. They have a whiff of anti-Semitism about them. They believe the German past was glorious without exception, including all the bad things that were done by Hitler. They don't openly praise them, but they do not criticize them. If that wing were to predominate in the party, and it is quite strong, then I think we have a real problem. I mean, we have situations, say, like if you look at Italy, where the pseudo-fascists have in fact taken over the government. They nevertheless are not so wildly fascistic that they have turned the country into a dictatorship, and for instance, I mean, the Italian government is supportive of the Ukraine, not of Russia. The AfD supports Russia. The AfD is basically authoritarian. I mean, there's no way in which they're a conventional democratic party. Even the conservative side of it, the relatively moderate side of it, I wouldn't want them in power either. They're like sort of right-wing Republicans. But it wouldn't necessarily be a catastrophe. But I think if the Björn Höcke side of the party, the fascist side of the party, took over the AFD and the AFD continued to poll 20, 25, 30% of the population in elections, then I think Germany would have a real problem. We would have a real problem.
And it is my understanding as well, when you wrote about the AFD at the end, they didn't necessarily start out as a super right-wing party. They kind of started out. It wasn't intentional to turn into a right-wing party.
It was a party that simply thought that they should not abandon the Deutschmark, and there should be a limit to how much European integration there should be, and so on. It was like a bunch of slightly grumpy right-wing academics. I mean, perfectly respectable people, but it was eventually hijacked by a group of people who were much more viscerally right-wing, much less intellectual, and very determined. And they rode their luck, and their luck has held.
And something you write about as well is Angela Merkel is the first, I believe, East German chancellor to have been elected. Do you think there is kind of a? Do you think German politics is going in a good direction by as we have seen that Angela Merkel has been the first East German chancellor? She kind of, I think a lot of people are nostalgic about it because she has been ruling for quite a while until Scholz took over took the. I don't remember the English word. We have a Norwegian expression about this, but I don't remember the English term for it. But Scholz took over. But do you think that Germany is headed in the right direction when it comes to politics? That this won't be, and like we talked about before the recording, there was 1,000 of protesters a while ago in late 2023 against the AFD in Hamburg, among others. I think other cities as well.
Oh yeah.
So there is a resentment towards, while they may have, as a comment in my video one time, 24%. There's still thousands of opponents of the AFD. Do you think that German politics is heading in the right direction?
Tens of hundreds of thousands of people were demonstrating in the streets at the beginning of 1933, determined to stop the Nazis from taking power. I mean, getting the number of people out in the streets is one thing, getting them to vote for you is another. I think Merkel is a very admirable woman in many ways, and she didn't really rule as an East German. I mean, her priorities were not particularly East German ones. She was pro-Russian, and lent Germany increase its dependency on Russian oil, particularly when she abandoned nuclear power. I don't think Germany knows what to do at the moment, and it's weak. They have a weak government which can't really agree among itself about what to do about the situation in, say, the Ukraine, and to do with, they've got a constitutional court which, because of the legacy of the hyperinflation of the 1920s, has as part of its constitution an extreme form of budgetary restraint. That means that the governments can't actually spend big money to solve big problems like climate change. I think the country is a mess, actually. I hate to say it because it's a wonderful country in which I'm extremely, but I think it's a mess. And I don't even know if the CDU manages to get back into power, who will share power with them, and what are they going to do? I don't know. The country is inherently equipped to be very successful in industries of various kinds. It's behind in certain ways. It's digitally archaic. Um, it it kind of hangs on to the Anglosphere in one side, and then it relies too much on exports. So all it needs, and in an unstable world of global trade, that is not good. If you're relying on selling a lot of things to, say, China, the fact that the Houthis are sinking ships in the Red Sea is not entirely irrelevant, because somehow that stuff has to get to and from its destinations. And in a much more dangerous world now, all these things have become much more difficult. So Germany has all kinds of problems that it doesn't really have the equipment to deal with, because it's still tooled up for being really West Germany in the 1960s and 70s, when
Yeah. I have one final question to ask you before we run up, and I don't know if this is a good comparison even, but the wall that we see in Palestine and Israel right now that they built, is it a kind of a good comparison to compare this wall to the Berlin Wall that we see in that we spoke about today? Is the wall in Palestine kind of similar to the Berlin Wall in a sense?
well, it is, because the wall around Gaza was like the Berlin Wall, intended to keep people in, not out. Um, to my mind, what both these things prove, the history of Berlin Wall and the history of things like the Gaza Wall, the fortifications that the Israelis put around Gaza in order to try and solve the problem of what to do about Gaza and all the Palestinians in it. The similarity is that in neither case, the East German government thought it could put a wall around West Berlin, and at best, maybe they would eventually give in and become part of East Germany, and they would be happy. At worst, they would contain the problem and mean that they could stop their people from going to West Berlin, and thereby keep their own system going. But in the case of Gaza, you build a wall when you can't think what else to do to solve the problem. In other words, as I said, the East German government could have liberalized its regime. They could have given their people a better standard of living. They could have allowed them more freedom of opinion and expression, all those things that might have reconciled them to the regime and made it more viable without building a wall. But they didn't want to do that. So they had to build the wall to force people. And I think the same thing applies with the Israeli government with Gaza, and to some extent with the West Bank too, which is you lock these people in, you think you're solving the problem, but you don't. Problems never go away. And they certainly don't go away if all you do is put a wall around them.
And
So
certainly we see it as the war going on in Gaza today, and that's part of why. I mean, it's the world's biggest prison, as people call it. So you wonder why people are being radicalized in Palestine when you live in this closed-up world. So you see that so it's not helping that they built a wall. And I want to know for you, is it easy to see a comparison with the Israeli government and East Berlin?
Well, the Netanyahu government decided it would simply imprison the Palestinians in Gaza, not exactly forget about them, because they couldn't forget about them, but keep them imprisoned there and then get on with their business elsewhere. Instead of helping them, instead of making a two-state solution, for instance, possible in the area of old Palestine and Israel, they decided they would simply lock the Palestinians in, and eventually it exploded, which it sort of had to, in the same way that East Germany exploded, if you will, in a much less violent fashion in 1989. But it just goes to show you cannot solve problems by militarizing them and simply imprisoning people and saying, I'm going to ignore you now. I'm going to put you in this box. I'm going to close the box, and I'm going to ignore you now and get on with what I want to do. And it doesn't work. Eventually, you get explosions happen, collapses happen, and it's much worse than it would have been if you hadn't done the imprisoning of these people in the first place. I mean, Germany is still solving the problem, or trying to solve the problem, caused by the division of the country after the Second World War. It's funny because, I mean, it's been 30 years since 1989, and we're still 35, and they still haven't found a way of making things good. It makes you wonder how Israelis and Palestinians are going to find some way of living together if even East and West Germans find it difficult to live together. It's very worrying. The fall of the Berlin Wall is kind of a joyful occasion. I mean, I've experienced it as such at the time, but a joyful occasion which then still has dark elements to it.
It has consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And you cannot get rid of those consequences. It's like a little diseased cell that has now grown back again. And I don't know. I'm very distressed at seeing what's happened in Germany, and the situation is only partly comparable to that in the Middle East. In the theory of, as I say, locking people away. But I'm very sorry that Germany is not a happy, united country, but it isn't.
I think we're gonna round it up there. I don't have a whole lot to say, and this is probably gonna be an episode of its own about Palestine. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go. Though I wish we could, but the focus of this episode has been about the war, not the Gaza Palestinian war, which I'm sure I will cover in the future. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, you got to edit all this down now. Huh?
Well, we'll see. Maybe not, but we'll see. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. And of course, where can people buy your book? It's if they want to read about the Berlin Wall.
It was published in Norway,
But where can people buy the book, and where can people find you if they have any further questions about the Berlin Wall? And where do you have anything else you want to promote?
I've got a website, fredericktaylorhistory.com.
Anything else you want to share? Anything else you want me to put in the description below?
I'll let you know my details. I'll email you.
Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. And this has been on That Age 12. We are available on social media under Twitter/X, under That Age 12, under Instagram for That Age 12. We update or share our episodes weekly. And you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, give us 5 stars if you like this episode. That would happen a lot. If you are on Apple Podcast, write a review. And of course, check out some of the other episodes we made. We have so many episodes that you're gonna love. Some great historians. Please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Erlend, and I'll see you next time.